In June of 1994, an expedition led by David Mearns would locate the wreck of MV Derbyshire, which was a remarkable find since the vessel went missing in Typhoon Orchid during 1980. It's not particularly unusual for vessels of this type to go missing during storms, but what is abnormal is their eventual location, especially 14 years after the fact, due to the relentless pressure and efforts of individuals who were connected to the 44 people who were lost in the disaster. The location of Derbyshire was a great moment of pride for David Mearns, and for the remainder of 1994, he would decide on future shipwrecks he intended to locate, and among these was HMS Hood, the former Royal Navy battlecruiser lost in the Denmark Strait during 1941. By this point, Dr. Robert Ballard had already found the wreckage of Bismarck, and it only felt necessary to complete the story by locating the wreck of Bismarck's one and only victim, the Hood. It was also important to locate the Hood's wreck for the historical record, as the Battle of Denmark Strait, from the Hood's perspective, was relatively blank, as only 3 individuals survived, and their perspectives of the Hood's disaster was rather limited. It was also worth finding the ship, as it was the single deadliest disaster the Royal Navy would suffer during the Second World War, with 1,418 men losing their lives. Over the next 6 years, much effort went into pinpointing a reasonable search area for the Hood's wreck. This would involve finding additional World War II shipwrecks to understand navigational errors between Royal Navy warships and German warships, pinpointing coordinates that other Royal Navy warships recorded for the loss of Hood that were involved in the Battle of the Denmark Strait, such as the heavy cruisers Norfolk, Suffolk, the battleship Prince of Wales, and the 6 escorting destroyers. Finally, it was important to study and create a better understanding of the geology of the Denmark Strait, as this was something David Mearns himself was not particularly comfortable with, and something he needed to expand upon before going on the hunt. A component of this expedition that would be interesting and unusual in comparison to the likes of the Bismarck was the fact that it would be partially funded by Television Channel 4, as they intended to make a documentary on the Battle of the Denmark Strait for the 60th anniversary in 2001. The catch in this agreement, which was a positive for both sides, was that David Mearns and his team were to relocate and film the Bismarck's wreck to guarantee that footage of a wreckage was located for the documentary, and the second portion of the investigation would be directed in locating the Hood. Even if the team failed to locate the Hood's wreck, they would still have footage of the Bismarck. Fortunately, due to the extensive research that went into this expedition, on the 19th of July 2001, after just 39 hours of attempting to locate Hood, its wreckage was found using the Ocean Explorer 6000 sonar. If you are invested in collecting more details about all of the events I have just discussed than my brief summary for this video, I would recommend getting The Deep-Sea Discovery of an Epic Battle, Hood and Bismarck by David Mearns himself. Hood's wreck was located in a relatively flat location of the Ermanger Basin in the Denmark Strait at a depth of 2,845 meters, or 1.7 miles. What became apparent and was rather surprising was the fact that Hood's hull was in 3 primary sections compared to the anticipated 2. Initially, it was expected that a forward and after section would be found, similar to that of the Japanese battleship Yamato, but in reality, the bow separated from the amidships, and the midships was separated from the stern. Along with these 3 primary sections of hull were 2 distinct debris fields, which would be labeled the western debris field and the eastern debris field. It is theorized that one of these fields was created during the initial explosion and sinking of the ship, while the other one was created during the separation of the bow from the midships. Let's take a look at each of the 3 primary hull segments first, as none of them are in the same orientation and none of them are in the same condition. The bow is laying on its port side shell plating, and it is approximately 30 meters or 100 feet long. It is difficult to get an accurate measurement, as it is believed that the bow ends where the ship's 3 bowers were once located, but they are no longer present. As far as it can be seen, all of the decks in the bow have collapsed, with the exception of the very tip of the forecastle, where the decking remains intact all the way back to the two forward hawse pipes. Internal deep decking cannot be seen, as looking into the hull is an abyss, and entry to the hull is strictly forbidden. It is also worth mentioning that there is additional decking extending farther aft on the starboard side of the bow, and it ends in the vicinity of the second hawse pipe, which is also present. At the time of Hood's sinking, it was equipped with 2 of its 3 anchors. Neither of these anchors were located, but the chains for the starboard anchor are still present and wrap down the starboard side shell plating. The overall shape of the bow is also significantly disordered. Where you work back to the voids where there are no decks, the shell plating begins to squeeze inward, having suffered from compression. It is also apparent that the lower hull, where the draft would have been, has also suffered from significant implosion compared to the upper hull. Overall, the bow is unremarkable, but highly recognizable, and the Roll of Honor plaque would be laid on its starboard fare lead by one of the 3 survivors, Ted Briggs. Moving approximately 700 meters or 2,300 feet south of the bow lies the upturned midship section, which, based on the side-scan sonar image, lies in a massive impact crater. This is by far the largest and most intact section of the ship's wreckage. It extends from the front of the A turret's barbette to the forward engine rooms. It is approximately 100 meters or 330 feet long. Since this segment of the wreck is resting upside down, we're not exactly certain as to how much of the superstructure is still attached to the hull. We are aware of various segments of the superstructure that became detached and are now in the debris field, but what has not been accounted for could very well be buried underneath this section of hull. Much like the bow, the midship section shows signs of a rapid sinking with excessive implosion damage. Immediately recognizable is the starboard side torpedo defense system, as its outer shell and crushing tubes are missing, exposing the protective longitudinal bulkhead, which was the innermost layer of the torpedo defense system. This would create the walls for the boiler and turbine rooms. On the port side, the torpedo defense system is still present, with the exception being at the forward and after ends, where the midship section separated from the bow and stern. The ship's floor, which was of a double-bottom design, shows excessive signs of implosion damage as well, as the outermost shell plating shows signs of having stretched and physically ripped apart under immense pressure. What was significant about this find is that prior to the discovery of Hood, there was a theory that the steel used in Hood's construction was of lower quality than it should have been, but some of the steel plates that had stretched up to 63%, and this meant that the steel was of very high quality, killing that theory entirely. When we go to the forward end of the midship section, there is a depression in the sea floor. This exposes the A and B barbettes. The A turret's gunhouse and guns are entirely missing, but the barbette is still within its casing, with many of its operational mechanisms in place. The B barbette is not as exposed, and it's not clear whether the gunhouse and guns are still in place or not, as this section of the turret is buried under the sand. At the forward end of the midship section, where the bow separated, the shell plating bends outwards, which is an indicator of an explosion. However, this was not the forward magazines, as this segment of the shipwreck is still intact. What it appears occurred, and is the more probable theory, is that there was initially an implosion that turned into an explosion due to excessive force, similar in working theory to what happened to Derbyshire during its sinking. When we go to the after section of the midship section, where it separated from the stern, there is excessive bending of the shell plating here as well, though this can be explained away by the after magazine's explosions. There is also a relatively intact bulkhead, which is believed to be the forward bulkhead of the forward turbine rooms. Being the most intact section of the wreck means that internally there are probably many surprises waiting to be discovered, but due to law, it is strictly forbidden to enter the wreck, including with ROV, so there are no photos or footage of the interior of the wreck. Moving on approximately 200 meters or 660 feet east of the bow, we run into the stern. Based on its orientation and condition, I consider the stern to be the most interesting segment of this wreck, as its condition is somewhere between the bow being completely gutted and the amidships being mostly intact, while its orientation provides a good all-around view of the hull structure. The stern has an overall length of approximately 40 meters or 130 feet. This means it goes from the stern post to the after end of the Y barbette. What this means in relation to the midships section is that the majority of the forward engine rooms, the entirety of the after engine rooms, the X magazine, and Y magazine were destroyed in the explosion and sinking of the ship. Focusing in on the stern, there are two orientations for the overall length. The intact segment of hull rests at an angle of approximately 45 degrees from the seabed. This means that the deck, port and starboard, and lower hull are all exposed. Where the hull plowed into the seabed at a 45-degree angle, the quarterdeck then folded into approximately a 45-degree angle in the vicinity of where the ship's church would have been. From the area of where the deck folds to the Y barbette, as far as can be seen, is just a deck. There is no hull structure below this, so it is referred to simply as a flap. What's remarkable is how intact the segment of hull sticking out of the seabed is. At the very stern post on the quarterdeck, we can still see the base of the ensign staff with its navigation light still attached. Underneath the hull, we can see that Hood's rudder is still in place and completely intact. It is locked in a 20-degree turn to port, which shows that Hood did begin or was into its turn to port. Sitting ahead of the rudder sits the two inboard propellers and some exposed shafting. The majority of their shafting was destroyed in the explosion that sank this ship, and the two outboard propellers were completely blasted off the hull during the explosion and now lie out in the debris field. Going back topside, many features that were on the quarterdeck are still easily recognizable today. The diagonally oriented rudder post plate is still in place, and slightly ahead of that resides two mostly intact mushroom vents. The preservation of the planking is also remarkable in this location of the wreck. If we go down to the flap and we move to its forward end, where the Y barbette would have once been, the distinct curvature of the Y barbette's casing is immediately recognizable, even though the Y barbette casing itself is not present. Moving on from the stern, I will briefly discuss the debris fields, as these are underexplored, and what has been seen is not easily identifiable. There are only a handful of components that we have certain identification of. At some point during the sinking, the control top to the foremast separated from its tripod legs and landed upside down in the debris field, exposing the starfish shape of its lower platform. Midway between the bow and stern rests a barbette on its side, and due to the condition of this barbette, it is thought to have been the Y barbette, as part of it is relatively intact, while part of it shows signs of an intense explosion from underneath. It is theorized that since the explosion most likely originated from the X magazine, that the side of the Y barbette facing the X magazine suffered extensive damage, while the side facing away from it remained relatively protected. As I alluded to when discussing the stern, the two outboard propellers are in the debris field. They are remarkably close to the bow section of the wreck, and they sit side by side. Resting a significant distance outside of any of the identified debris fields to the northwest sits the conning tower on its side. The position of the conning tower is one of the great mysteries of Hood's wreck, as it doesn't make much sense. There are a handful of theories that have been presented to explain its position, but none of them can be taken for certain. Another interesting find in the debris fields was the rear of one of Hood's 21-inch torpedoes. This discovery effectively killed the theory that the torpedoes resulted in a chain reaction that caused the explosion and sinking of the ship. The final item I wish to discuss in this video is one of the ship's 3 bells, which was located on top of a pile of the captain's aft cabins. The story behind this bell is what makes it unique and worth mentioning. Initially, this bell was used aboard the battleship Hood, and when it was retired, the bell was gifted to Admiral Sir Horace Hood. Of course, Horace Hood would be killed aboard his flagship Invincible during the Battle of Jutland. The bell remained on land and was the property of Horace Hood's widow. Once when the battlecruiser Hood was completed, she gifted it to the battlecruiser and it remained on board to the very end. The significance behind this bell would result in the government permitting it as the only salvageable item from the wreck, and in August of 2015 it was recovered and is currently on display at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth. While Hood's wreckage did not give away a definitive answer as to why the ship exploded in such a violent manner, it did explain why the vessel sank so quickly, why so many men died, and it also explained various historical dilemmas that had previously been debated. Today, much like its three ancestors lost during the Battle of Jutland, Hood resides as a peaceful and protective grave for the individuals who were lost that disastrous day. With that having been said, I have nothing more I wish to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.